What if I told you the greatest land deal in American history happened by accident? The Louisiana Purchase wasn't planned. It wasn't the result of years of strategy or war. It was a geopolitical curveball, an offer so outrageous, so unexpected, that it nearly stunned President Thomas Jefferson into silence. In 1803, the United States was still young. Just 27 years old, this fragile republic stretched only as far west as the Mississippi River. Everything beyond that, 828,000 square miles, belonged to France. It was known as the Louisiana Territory, and it was vast, wild, and largely unexplored by Americans. It held untold riches, towering mountain ranges, massive river systems, and lands inhabited by hundreds of native nations. But for Jefferson, it was a looming unknown, and a strategic vulnerability. At the heart of the anxiety sat New Orleans. Whoever controlled that port controlled trade on the Mississippi. And in a world before railroads and highways, that meant everything. Farmers in Ohio and Kentucky needed it to survive. If New Orleans fell under hostile hands, the American economy could be strangled. Then came Napoleon. The French emperor was fighting wars across Europe. His dream of a Western empire was crumbling. His army in Haiti had been ravaged by disease and rebellion. And with British warships circling, he needed money, fast. So, in a moment of desperation, Napoleon sent a message: would the United States like to buy the entire Louisiana Territory? Jefferson was stunned. He had only asked about New Orleans. Now he was being offered a landmass that would double the size of the United States. But could he do it? Would it even be constitutional? This was more than a land deal. It was the moment America stood on the edge of its future, and took the leap. A fragile republic, a restless world. In the early 1800s, the world was in flux. Empires were rising and falling. Monarchs were being dethroned. The Atlantic Ocean wasn't just a watery border, it was a global chessboard, and the United States was still a pawn among kings. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, had a vision for his country. He imagined a nation of farmers, independent and self-reliant, living off the land. But that dream was boxed in. To the east, the Atlantic. To the west, the vast and mysterious Louisiana Territory, French land. To the north, British Canada. And to the south, Spanish Florida. The U.S. was hemmed in by European powers on all sides. Meanwhile, across the ocean, France was drowning in conflict. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had declared himself first consul for life, was at war with nearly every major power in Europe. His ambitions stretched across oceans, but his resources were wearing thin. His foothold in the New World, primarily Haiti, then called Saint-Domingue, was slipping away due to a massive slave revolt led by Toussaint Louverture. Thousands of French troops had died from yellow fever, and the colony was becoming ungovernable. With Haiti crumbling, Napoleon saw less need for Louisiana. His dream of a Western empire, stretching from the Caribbean to the Mississippi, was evaporating. But still, he held the Louisiana Territory, a vast expanse that could be used, sold, or lost to the British in war. At the same time, tensions between France and the United States were growing. The U.S. desperately wanted guaranteed access to the Mississippi River and, more importantly, the port of New Orleans. Jefferson feared that if Napoleon held on to Louisiana, it could trigger war. So Jefferson sent James Monroe and Robert Livingston to France, not to buy Louisiana, but just New Orleans and the surrounding area. They carried a budget of $10 million. Nothing more. But history had other plans. The offer that changed everything. Paris, 1803. James Monroe and Robert Livingston walked into negotiations expecting a narrow outcome, a possible purchase of New Orleans and perhaps some access to nearby waterways. What they encountered was a diplomatic shockwave. Napoleon's foreign minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, didn't stall or haggle. Instead, he threw a bombshell on the table: what if the United States bought all of Louisiana? It wasn't a bluff. France needed cash, and Napoleon needed to offload territory that had become a strategic liability. His ambitions in the Caribbean had failed. His troops were dying. And he was preparing for another war with Britain. Selling Louisiana wasn't just convenient, it was necessary. Livingston and Monroe were stunned. This wasn't a minor land acquisition, it was an offer to double the size of their country. The land stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border. And no one in Washington had prepared for this. Still, Livingston seized the moment. He recognized the magnitude of what was being offered. It would give the United States access to critical waterways, vast fertile land, and immeasurable natural resources. It would ensure the U.S. was no longer boxed in by European powers. After tense days of quiet negotiations, France named its price, $15 million, about 4 cents an acre. There was no time to consult Jefferson. Monroe and Livingston had to act on instinct, diplomacy, and vision. And so, they agreed. The treaty was signed on April 30, 1803. Even Talleyrand, known for his cunning, seemed amused by how easily the deal came together. Napoleon, ever the strategist, reportedly said, "I have given England a rival who, sooner or later, will humble her pride." What had just transpired wasn't merely a land purchase. It was one of the boldest, most consequential deals in global history. And back in Washington, President Jefferson had no idea. Jefferson's dilemma, vision versus Constitution. When news of the Louisiana Purchase finally reached President Thomas Jefferson, it arrived not with celebration, but with anxiety. He was a man of ideals, of Enlightenment thought, of strict constitutional interpretation. And now his diplomats had spent $15 million, without permission, to buy a piece of land larger than all the original 13 colonies combined. Jefferson's first reaction? He questioned if the deal was even legal. Nowhere in the U.S. Constitution did it explicitly say a president could buy foreign land. Jefferson, a firm believer in limited federal power, feared that endorsing such an acquisition might betray the very principles on which he had built his political career. He wrote to advisers about proposing a constitutional amendment to authorize the purchase. But then reality set in. Jefferson knew this was a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The Louisiana Territory offered not only land, but rivers, forests, mountains, and boundless potential. It could secure the Republic's future. And perhaps more importantly, it could keep France, Britain, or Spain from threatening American sovereignty. So, he made a choice. Rather than let constitutional rigidity paralyze progress, Jefferson leaned on the treaty-making power granted to the executive branch. If treaties were allowed, and land was part of a treaty, then perhaps this transaction, though vast, was constitutional after all. The Senate ratified the Louisiana Purchase Treaty in October 1803 with overwhelming support. What began as a legal quandary turned into political triumph. But the purchase raised deeper questions. Who lived on this land? What boundaries truly existed? What were the obligations to Native American tribes already inhabiting the region? These were issues the U.S. had barely begun to grapple with. Still, for Jefferson, this was about legacy. He called the acquisition a noble bargain, a move that would preserve American agrarian democracy for generations. In reality, it was a bold leap into the unknown. With a stroke of the pen, the United States doubled in size. But what lay within that vast, uncharted land? That was the mystery, and the next great adventure. Mapping the mystery, the Lewis and Clark expedition. Before the ink was dry on the Louisiana Purchase Treaty, the United States found itself the owner of a vast, unmapped wilderness. President Jefferson, ever the scientist and visionary, knew that buying the land was only the beginning. Understanding it, charting it, was the next challenge. Enter Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. In 1804, Jefferson commissioned these two military men, friends and explorers at heart, to lead an expedition into the unknown. Their mission wasn't just to map the territory, it was to discover its secrets, its rivers, mountains, native peoples, flora, and fauna. To determine whether a practical water route to the Pacific Ocean, a Northwest Passage, might exist. And to assert an American presence before rival nations could contest the claim. With 45 men, the Corps of Discovery set out from St. Louis, paddling westward into a land no American had seen. They were armed with journals, instruments, and Jefferson's detailed instructions. And they were guided, famously, by Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman whose knowledge and diplomacy would prove essential. The expedition was grueling. The terrain shifted from flood-prone plains to snow-covered peaks. The Missouri River was both a lifeline and a trap. The Rocky Mountains loomed like a wall. Along the way, they encountered over 50 native tribes, each with its own customs, languages, and attitudes toward the newcomers. Yet somehow, they endured. By late 1805, Lewis and Clark reached the Pacific Ocean. They had achieved what few thought possible. Their return in 1806 was met with awe. The data they brought back, geographic notes, animal samples, maps, reshaped America's understanding of its own borders. Grizzly bears, prairie dogs, giant herds of bison, these weren't myths. They were real, and they were now American. Scholars still debate whether Jefferson's goal of a Northwest Passage was naive. But the Lewis and Clark expedition gave the young republic something greater than maps. It gave it imagination. A sense that America's destiny didn't end at the Mississippi, it had only just begun. And as settlers followed in their footsteps, that vast land would soon become the nation's new frontier. The native dilemma, whose land was it, really? The Louisiana Purchase was hailed as a victory for American expansion, but to whom did this land truly belong? The answer wasn't France. It wasn't Spain. And it wasn't the United States. It belonged to the dozens of Native American nations who had lived, hunted, and thrived across these territories for thousands of years. To the U.S. government, the Louisiana Purchase was a diplomatic windfall. But for the tribes, from the Sioux of the Northern Plains to the Osage of the Ozarks, it was an ominous thunderclap. Land that had never been ceded or sold was now claimed by a foreign government they had never agreed to recognize. Almost overnight, America's frontier policy changed. Treaties were drafted, usually under pressure. Military outposts sprang up. Settlers followed behind explorers, and with them came disease, fences, and conflict. Jefferson, in theory, believed Native Americans could be civilized into American society, converted into farmers, Christians, and neighbors. But even this paternalistic vision masked a darker reality: removal. If native peoples didn't assimilate, they would be pushed aside. One of the earliest signs of this policy came not long after the Purchase, when the Osage tribe was pressured into ceding vast territories in present-day Missouri and Arkansas. Others would soon follow. The floodgates had opened. Native resistance rose too. Some tribes sought alliances, others prepared for war. What followed in later decades was a long, painful unraveling of sovereignty, broken treaties, forced marches, massacres. It would all begin here, in this moment, under the banner of progress. Modern scholars still grapple with this contradiction: how a democratic republic, founded on liberty, justified the systematic displacement of indigenous nations. The Louisiana Purchase became the legal pretext for what would become a century of westward expansion and dispossession. It's a story often overshadowed by tales of exploration and growth. But it's the shadow that follows every triumph. The price of empire was paid not in gold alone, but in land, lives, and legacies erased. And yet, native cultures endured, adapted, and resisted, leaving marks on this land far older than any treaty. From wilderness to settlement, the expansion rush begins. By the end of the first decade of the 1800s, the Louisiana Territory was no longer a question mark on a map, it was a magnet. For opportunity. For speculation. For dreams both humble and grand. The vast stretches of fertile plains, untapped forests, and navigable rivers beckoned settlers with promises of prosperity. For struggling families in the East, the West symbolized a second chance. For land speculators, it was an investment bonanza. And for enslavers in the South, it was a chance to expand the plantation economy into new territories. The U.S. government, eager to populate its new lands, passed acts encouraging migration, offering cheap plots or even land grants to veterans. The Homestead Act wouldn't come until later, but the seeds were already being sown. Wagons began creaking westward. Flatboats drifted down the Mississippi. Entire communities packed up and vanished from coastal towns, only to reappear in names like New St. Louis or Little Cincinnati, deep in the wilderness. Townships, courthouses, and churches followed the settlers, brick by brick. Yet progress was uneven. Infrastructure was minimal. Maps were often wrong or incomplete. And nature itself pushed back, tornadoes, floods, harsh winters. For many, the American dream came with a steep price tag. The federal government also faced an enormous logistical challenge: how to govern and organize the territory. In 1804, the area was split into two administrative zones: the Territory of Orleans, which would become Louisiana State, and the District of Louisiana. It was a patchwork at first, with military governors and shifting boundaries. But slowly, order began to take shape. As towns grew, so did commerce. River ports like St. Louis became bustling trade centers. French, Spanish, African, and native cultures collided and mixed with Anglo-American newcomers, giving rise to a uniquely frontier identity, gritty, diverse, and unpolished. But with every log cabin raised and field plowed, the United States moved further from a coastal republic and closer to a continental empire. This wasn't just settlement. It was transformation. A land once viewed as wilderness was becoming the blueprint for the American future, rugged, expanding, and restless.